What if the most terrifying ruler in history wasn't a man drunk with power, but a woman who turned cruelty into religion? The chronicles call her the Scarlet Empress, yet no one agrees whether she was divine or demonic. What we do know is that her empire bled, literally, for centuries under her crimson laws. Her name became a whisper forbidden to speak, a warning passed from mother to daughter. Never rise too high, or you'll become her. She emerged in a collapsing world where faith had lost its grip and men slaughtered each other for kingdoms already in ruins. Into that chaos walked a woman wrapped in red silk and prophecy. Legends say the sky turned the same color the day she was crowned, as if the heavens themselves had bled to seal her reign. Her first decree wasn't about land or law, it was about purity. She demanded that her court wear red, to remind them of the price of loyalty. Those who refused vanished. Those who obeyed she marked with her own hand, sometimes with paint, sometimes with fire. But where did she come from? Some claimed she was the daughter of a concubine, others that she had been a slave who seduced her master and poisoned him on their wedding night. Yet her real power wasn't seduction, it was belief. She convinced her followers that she was chosen by the gods of vengeance, the living embodiment of balance between sin and punishment. Her sermons were poetry laced with venom, teaching that pain cleansed the soul and that obedience was the highest form of worship. Within months, her empire changed. The court became theater, drenched in ritual and superstition. She ordered every mirror in the palace removed, claiming reflections tempted vanity. Servants had to walk backward when leaving her presence, to avoid stealing her essence. The line between religion and madness dissolved, and still, people adored her. They didn't see a tyrant, they saw salvation wearing a woman's face. But perhaps the most disturbing truth is that her cruelty had logic. Every ritual, every tradition, carried a purpose beneath the horror. The feasts where dancers bled were said to feed the ancestors. The punishments for liars weren't random, they were symbols, carefully choreographed to teach moral lessons through fear. To understand her world is to step into a labyrinth where every atrocity was justified as divine necessity. Some historians argue that her reign wasn't real at all, just an allegory written by monks terrified of women's power. Others believe the ruins of her temples still exist, buried under deserts, sealed by red clay that locals refuse to disturb. What's undeniable is how her story survived, long after her supposed death, shaping myths of queens, goddesses, and demons alike. But what if there's more truth than legend in her tale? What if the most horrifying traditions she created were not lost, but quietly absorbed into later empires, disguised as culture, ceremony, or faith? Think about that for a moment. The next time you see a crown, a robe, or a ritual painted in red, how much of it still belongs to her? Have you ever noticed how some symbols of power carry an unease we can't explain? That's the shadow of her legacy, still breathing beneath our civilizations. If this story has already made you question what's called tradition, take a second to share your thoughts below. Do you believe her cruelty was madness or method? Leave a comment with your opinion. Hit the like button if this glimpse into ancient power intrigues you, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next, because the next chapter of her story only grows darker from here. She did not begin her reign with a massacre. That would have been too obvious, too crude, too easy to resist. Instead, the Scarlet Empress began with a promise. She stood before a court of exhausted generals, suspicious nobles, and priests terrified of losing relevance, and told them exactly what they wanted to hear: stability, order, and a destiny, greater than anything their fathers had dreamed of. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, when she spoke of rebuilding roads, restoring temples, feeding the hungry. But every vow of prosperity came chained to a condition: loyalty, absolute and unquestioned. The first tradition was born on the night of her coronation, behind doors that were supposed to be closed to common eyes, yet somehow descriptions of it spread like smoke. It was called the Oath of Ash and Blood. Each high official had to approach the throne barefoot, carrying a small bowl filled with ashes from the last war. Villages burned, cities taken, lives erased. At the foot of her steps, they pricked their own finger and let a single drop of blood fall into the bowl. Then they had to look into her eyes and swear that any future flames would burn only for her. On the surface, it sounded symbolic, almost theatrical. But there was a detail no one missed. Those who hesitated, even for a heartbeat, never appeared in public. Again. Some said they were exiled. Others whispered they were taken to underground chambers where a very different kind of ritual awaited them. The fact that no body, no trial, no official explanation ever appeared made the fear more effective than any public execution could have been. Her second tradition came disguised as mercy. The empire had been ravaged by decades of conflict, and prisons overflowed with thieves, deserters, and political enemies. She announced a cleansing of chains, a grand amnesty to show her compassion. Families rejoiced, believing their loved ones would return home. Instead, the prisoners were marched, under guard, to the capital's main square, where a massive platform had been erected and draped in red cloth. They were given a choice: remain branded as criminals or be reborn in scarlet service. Those who chose rebirth had their shackles removed, but only to have their wrists marked with a narrow, permanent ring of red pigment that never fully faded. They became the first of her scarlet servitors, a new class of half-slave, half-soldier, bound by ritual more than by iron. They could move through the city, even earn wages, but their lives belonged to her will. Any act of disobedience was interpreted as a betrayal not just of the Empress, but of the gods she claimed to represent. What made these early traditions so horrifying was not simply the control they exerted, but how quickly people participated in them. Nobles competed to spill their blood before her, hoping to be seen as more loyal than their rivals. Families pressured imprisoned relatives to accept rebirth instead of punishment, convinced it was a second chance. Priests rewrote liturgies overnight to align ancient prophecies with her decrees, insisting these ceremonies had always been destined to happen. Soon, no important decision was made without invoking one of her new rituals. Promotions, alliances, even marriages inside the court were sealed with gestures she had invented. A hand pressed to the heart and then to the lips in her direction, a ribbon of red tied around the right wrist, a whispered phrase pledging scarlet fidelity. In less than a year, what began as a few symbolic acts had hardened into sacred obligations. Refusing them did not just mark someone as disloyal, it painted them as unclean, cursed, dangerous to stand beside. And beneath all of it, there was a question no one dared to ask aloud. If these were only the first traditions she created, what would come next? Once the empire was fully in her grasp and fear alone was no longer enough to satisfy her. The court soon realized that the Empress did not merely want obedience, she wanted participation. She wanted the elite to perform their loyalty in ways that could never be forgotten or hidden. That was how the court revels began. Festivities that were engineered not for joy, but for surveillance. At first, they resembled ordinary banquets, with dancers, music, and endless wine. But gradually, the atmosphere shifted. The entertainers chosen were not skilled performers from distant provinces. They were prisoners, political captives, and debtors whose presence was meant to remind the audience of her power. Bound in silk cords dyed red, they performed movements that looked graceful from a distance, but carried a disturbing stiffness up close, as if choreographed under threat. The nobles were instructed to applaud at precise moments. Failure to match the rhythm of collective celebration was interpreted as silent dissent. Over time, the Empress introduced new games into these gatherings. One involved placing sealed jars throughout the hall. Some contained perfumes or jewels. Others held scorpions, snakes, or severed animal heads preserved in wine. Guests were invited to choose a jar and open it in front of the crowd. The Empress claimed it tested intuition and purity of spirit, but everyone knew it was a lesson in unpredictability and submission. No matter what emerged, participants were expected to smile, bow, and thank the Empress for her wisdom. Even the meals became rituals of intimidation. Dishes were arranged to resemble battlefield carnage. Roasted birds dyed red, fish served with their eyes intact, bowls of spiced broth thickened to mimic blood. The Empress insisted these presentations honored ancestors lost to war, but no one could ignore the way she watched her guests as they ate, studying who hesitated before taking the first bite. As seasons passed, cruelty became innovation. One tradition involved reenactments of past betrayals. Actors, again often real prisoners, were forced to portray traitors being confronted and punished. The Empress rewrote these scenes each year, crafting narratives that conveniently aligned with her current political needs. If a noble had recently displeased her, their family might find themselves depicted as villains in the performance. No direct accusation was made, but the audience understood the warning. Another game required guests to draw small carved tokens from a lacquered box. Each token bore an emblem: a serpent, a dagger, a sun, a tear. The meanings were never explained, yet the reactions they elicited changed the fate of whoever drew them. Those who received the serpent might be questioned by the palace guard within days. Those who drew the sun were suddenly invited to more intimate audiences with the Empress. The rules were fluid, unpredictable, and crafted to keep everyone off balance. By the end of each revel, the nobles would stumble out of the hall exhausted, their nerves frayed from hours of forced pleasure. Some returned home trembling, convinced they had failed some invisible test. Others were ecstatic, believing they had passed. And yet none could articulate what exactly they had been judged on. That was her brilliance. She created a system where fear became entertainment, where spectacle replaced logic, and where every person in the room became both performer and captive. But the most disturbing aspect was how quickly these rituals spread beyond the palace. Merchants copied the games for private gatherings. Priests incorporated elements of the performances into seasonal festivals, and families began using simplified versions as rites of passage. What had started as the Empress's twisted form of pageantry transformed into a cultural standard, absorbing the empire from its center outward. And with each passing year, the line between celebration and punishment thinned until they became indistinguishable. What no one realized yet was that these revels were only the initiation phase. A more intricate, more sinister layer of ritual was already being crafted in the depths of the palace, one that would demand far more than applause or forced laughter. The deeper one descended into the palace, the more the color red seemed to thicken in the air. It clung to the tapestries, stained the marble tiles, and pulsed like a heartbeat behind the carved doors of the inner sanctum. This was where the Scarlet Empress shaped the rituals that defined her rule, not the feasts meant to unsettle the nobles, but the rites intended to bind their souls. Here, the cult of the scarlet hue reached its most disturbing expressions. What started as symbolic gestures in the early months of her reign evolved into permanent marks etched into the bodies of her followers. The initiation into her inner circle was called the Veil of Vi. Crimson. Participants entered a windowless chamber lit only by braziers burning a sweet metallic incense that coated the throat. They were instructed to remove all jewelry and any fragment of color except red. At the center of the room stood a basin filled with a thick, crimson mixture made from powdered minerals, herbs, and something else no one could ever quite identify. The Empress would dip her fingers into the basin, then draw a line across the initiate's forehead. The mark never washed. Off completely, leaving a faint permanent trace that served as both branding and vow. But the mark was only the beginning. Those who wished to rise within her hierarchy underwent a second ritual, one both more painful and more intimate: the binding cut. Instead of ink or pigment, a thin blade, cooled in sacred oils, was used to carve a small but deliberate symbol on the left shoulder. The wound was then sprinkled with a red powder that caused it to sting for days, making the body remember submission long after the ceremony ended. The empress claimed the cut represented rebirth through sacrifice. Others believed it was a way for her to taste fear directly from the skin of her followers. Her priestesses, known as the Daughters of the Flame, were responsible for maintaining these rituals and adding layers of mysticism to them. They memorized the empress's teachings, repeated them during ceremonies, and recorded every cut, every mark, every vow in scrolls sealed with vermilion wax. To be chosen as a Daughter of the Flame was an honor that demanded unwavering loyalty. Rumors whispered that their final test involved offering a drop of their own blood into the empress's private chalice. Whether true or not, the daughters never denied it. Silence was their devotion. Even clothing became an extension of this cult. The empress decreed that garments should reflect inner allegiance, and so every robe, sash, and draped fabric worn in her presence bore at least one strip of red. These strips varied in width and placement, each signaling a person's rank in her service. A simple servant might wear a thin ribbon tied at the wrist, while a high advisor might be wrapped in layers of scarlet silk. The more red one bore, the more power and scrutiny they attracted. Over time, these traditions spread beyond the palace walls. Craftsmen created dyes inspired by the empress's palette, merchants sold amulets shaped like the binding cut, and ordinary citizens began wearing red, threads around their arms to imitate the elite. Fear and fascination intertwined until the color itself became a form of worship. And in villages far from the capital, mothers warned their daughters never to stare too long into the fire, for flame was said to carry the empress's gaze. What none of them understood was that these markings, these symbols, were part of a larger design. The empress was crafting more than obedience. She was constructing identity. Each cut, each stain of pigment, each scarlet garment turned her subjects into extensions of her will, walking echoes of her power. And once shaped, they could not easily return to who they were before. Their bodies had been claimed, and their spirits were being prepared for something far more consuming. Before we move on, share what you think about these rituals. Do you believe such symbols were tools of devotion or weapons of control? Leave a comment with your thoughts so we can explore this darkness together as the story unfolds. The empress's obsession with symbols did not stop at the body or the court. It extended onto the battlefield, where her traditions took on their most violent and theatrical form. To her, war was not merely a clash of armies. It was a stage where fear was the sharpest weapon, and ritual the greatest strategy. She understood that soldiers fight harder when they believe they are part of something sacred, and she knew enemies crumble faster when they think they are facing not an army, but an omen. Before every campaign, the troops underwent a ritual known as the Crimson Preparation. At dawn, the Daughters of the Flame would walk between the ranks carrying bowls of a red mixture warmed over embers. Soldiers were instructed to remove their helmets and lower their heads. With deliberate slowness, the priestesses smeared a streak of red across each soldier's brow, whispering a blessing that sounded more like a warning. The mixture smelled of iron and smoke, and its consistency clung to the skin long after it dried. To the empress, this was not merely paint, it was intention. By marking them, she declared them instruments of her will. But the true spectacle began after battle. The empress believed victory required acknowledgement not just from her people, but from the spirits she claimed guided her. And so she created the Rite of Returning, a chilling ceremony performed as soon as the last arrow fell. Fallen enemies were arranged in intricate patterns on the ground, forming symbols visible from the cliffs where the Empress often watched her campaigns. Captured enemy banners were soaked in red dye and hung from pikes, transforming the battlefield into a shrine of conquest. Soldiers moved in solemn formation, stepping around the bodies as if they were part of a sacred mosaic. Sometimes prisoners were forced to witness the rite. Bound and kneeling, they watched their defeated comrades become offerings to the Empress's ideology. Some survivors claimed this broke their will more effectively than torture, for it transformed death into ritual, stripping battles of humanity and turning them into myth. Her army, too, was shaped by tradition. The Empress created an elite unit composed entirely of women, known as the Bloodbound Guard. Chosen for strength, agility, and unwavering loyalty, they underwent rigorous training that combined combat techniques with ceremonial discipline. Their armor was lacquered in shades of deep red, and each member carried a curved blade engraved with the same symbols carved into the Empress's private chambers. They fought silently, moving with precision that unnerved even their allies. To enemies, they were ghosts in crimson armor, the living embodiment of the Empress's wrath. Before battles, the Bloodbound Guard performed a ritual dance that blended martial movement with spiritual invocation. They circled the Empress, blades drawn, tracing patterns in the air meant to symbolize the slicing away of fear. The dance was mesmerizing, and soldiers watching felt either inspired or terrified. It blurred the line between warrior and priestess, turning combat into liturgy. Her psychological strategies extended beyond her troops. Messages were sent to enemy leaders written in crimson ink, describing the fates of other commanders who had resisted her. Sometimes these letters were accompanied by artifacts taken from defeated opponents, a ring, a weapon, or a strip of red-stained cloth. The Empress understood that fear could travel faster than armies, softening resistance before her soldiers arrived. Even the march itself became a tradition of intimidation. Her armies carried drums tuned to deep, resonant frequencies that echoed across valleys. At night, they lit torches arranged in spirals visible from miles away, making it seem as though a living flame advanced across the land. Villagers fled at the sight, convinced that resisting would bring not just defeat, but punishment woven into ritual. Through all this, the Empress's true brilliance lay in the way she merged brutality with belief. Every gesture, every formation, every scarlet emblem turned war into a ceremony, and soldiers into participants in a grand, terrible tradition. And as these practices spread, they created a legacy of fear so powerful that even generations after her death, enemies whispered her name before battle, hoping they would face mortal soldiers, not the rituals she had carved into history. If the battlefield was where the Scarlet Empress displayed her dominance to the world, the private chambers of her palace were where she exercised her most calculated forms of control. Here, violence was not loud or spectacular. It was quiet, intimate, and deliberate. The Empress understood something few rulers ever dared to acknowledge, that the body of a woman, her alliances, her fertility, her reputation, was one of the most powerful instruments in any political system. And she weaponized it with a precision that made even her allies uneasy. Her first reform targeted the institution of marriage among the nobility. She abolished traditional wedding ceremonies and replaced them with the scarlet binding, a ritual in which brides were required to demonstrate loyalty not to their husbands, but directly to the Empress. During the ceremony, the bride and groom stood before a brazier of burning red resin. The Empress, or one of her daughters of the flame, would tie a scarlet cord around the bride's wrist. The groom received no such mark. The implication was clear. Women belonged first to the Empress, and only secondarily to their husbands. This shift in allegiance disrupted powerful families, undermining old patriarchal structures, and forcing every faction to acknowledge that true authority flowed from the throne. Concubines and secondary wives were subjected to even stricter traditions. Before entering the palace, they were required to undergo the trial of purity, an ordeal involving fasting, isolation, and a ceremonial inspection conducted by priestesses trained to detect signs of deceit or disloyalty. Officially, the trial was meant to ensure the empress's household remained spiritually clean. Unofficially, it served to break the will of the women who entered her domain. Many emerged silent, their eyes hollowed by fear or exhaustion. A few never emerged at all. For women already within the palace, fertility became a tool of surveillance. The empress declared that every pregnancy among the nobility must be reported within 3 days of suspicion. Midwives were required to keep detailed records, dates of conception, lineage histories, even the emotional state of the mother. These records were delivered directly to the palace, where they were reviewed by the daughters of the flame. In some cases, a woman who conceived without the empress's blessing found herself summoned for questioning. A pregnancy could be interpreted as ambition, a miscarriage as a sign of impurity. Motherhood was no longer a private experience. It was a political act. The empress also instituted a chilling tradition known as the Chamber of Reflection. Noble women accused of betrayal, sometimes for real offenses, sometimes for imagined ones, were locked inside a small, windowless room lit by a single red lamp. On the first day, they were left alone in silence. On the second, they were questioned by priestesses who spoke in riddles, probing their fears and loyalties. By the third day, most women confessed to crimes they had never committed, desperate to prove devotion. The Chamber of Reflection was not designed to punish the body. It was designed to fracture the mind. Beyond the palace walls, ordinary women were not spared the influence of these traditions. Rural communities began adopting their own simplified versions of the scarlet binding, believing it protected marriages from misfortune. Mothers braided thin red cords into their daughters' hair to invite the empress's blessing, unaware they were participating in a system born from domination. What had begun as a set of elite customs seeped into everyday life, entwining itself with folklore, superstition, and inherited fear. The empress understood that to control a society, one must control the women who shape it, its households, its children, its stories. By redefining their rituals, she rewrote the rhythm of the empire itself. And as her influence deepened, the most vulnerable victims were not soldiers on the battlefield or nobles at court. They were the women who lived under traditions crafted to bind them in ways neither visible nor easily undone. What few realized was that these rituals were preparing the next generation for something far darker, a plan that reached children long before they ever stepped into her presence. Children were the one resource the Scarlet Empress considered more valuable than gold, land, or even soldiers. Adults could be persuaded, broken, or replaced, but children could be shaped. Molded early enough, they would never question her authority because they would never know a world without it. And so she designed traditions specifically for them, forging an upbringing that blended discipline, fear, and ambition into a single doctrine. To the outside world, these customs appeared to be rites of passage. In truth, they were mechanisms for manufacturing loyalty from the cradle. The first of these customs was the ceremony of first shadow, performed when a child turned 5. Families were required to bring their sons and daughters to district temples, where priestesses observed them through a lattice screen. The children were instructed to walk across a floor painted with shifting patterns, spirals, jagged lines, circles that seemed to pulse under the dim red lanterns. The goal was not agility or grace, but reaction. Priestesses recorded which children hesitated, which moved with confidence, which followed the painted lines and which broke them. These observations determined a child's future training. A hesitating child might be sent to agricultural schools, while a fearless one might be assigned to military academies or drawn into priestesshood. From an age when most children were learning simple games, the Empress's subjects were being classified like assets. At age 9 came the Red Vigil, a week-long ordeal that every child from noble lineage was required to endure. They were taken to remote outposts, where torches burned through the night, casting trembling shadows across the stone courtyards. The children were expected to keep watch in silence for long stretches, observing the dark and reporting any movement they perceived. Whether they truly saw anything mattered little. The test was designed to teach endurance, suspicion, and the idea that danger was ever present. Some children returned proud, convinced they had glimpsed spirits or omens. Others returned quieter, their nights filled with memories they could not fully understand or articulate. For the children of the court, training was even harsher. They participated in the trials of balance, a series of exercises that combined physical challenges with moral dilemmas. A child might be ordered to choose between saving a fellow trainee from falling or completing a complex pattern drawn on the ground. Their choices were evaluated not by outcome, but by intent. The Empress believed a person's true nature revealed itself in moments of conflict, and she sought to identify ruthlessness at an early age. Children who demonstrated decisive, emotionless judgment were guided toward roles close to the throne. Those who showed empathy were quietly redirected to less influential paths. The most ambitious tradition of all, however, was the creation of the Red Heirs. Each year, the Empress selected a small group of exceptionally talented children, boys and girls alike, to live and train within the palace. They studied combat, philosophy, ritual, and strategy, watched constantly by tutors who reported every outburst, every whisper, every spark of rebellion. These children became symbols of the empire's future, avatars of the Empress's ideology. Some believed she intended for one of them to succeed her, though the Empress herself never confirmed nor denied this. Instead, she allowed the uncertainty to deepen their devotion. To be chosen was to receive honor. To disappoint her was to risk everything. Outside the palace, families spoke of these rites, with a mixture of awe and dread. Some hoped their children would be chosen for greatness, believing it proof of divine favor. Others prayed their sons and daughters would remain unnoticed, safe from the unforgiving expectations of the Empress's world. But no matter their feelings, every family lived beneath the weight of traditions that turned childhood into preparation. And through all of this, one unsettling truth grew clearer with each generation. Children raised in systems of fear often learn not just to endure it, but to replicate it. The Empress was not shaping followers. She was creating successors to her cruelty, weaving her legacy directly into the hearts of the young. Share your thoughts on this. Do you think children shaped through fear can ever break free from the shadows they were raised in? Leave a comment with your perspective as we continue unraveling the Empress's legacy. While the Scarlet Empress shaped the minds of children and the bodies of her followers, she wielded another instrument of power with equal precision: the spiritual class that served her. The empire had always held a complex relationship with religion, fractured between ancient nature cults, ancestral worship, and the rigid doctrines of wandering mystics. The Empress saw opportunity in this chaos. She understood that belief, once harnessed, could justify anything, and so she restructured the spiritual hierarchy, placing women at its center and binding priesthood and monarchy into a single entity, her own. The priestesses who served her were known as the veiled vessels, women trained from childhood to interpret omens, deliver rituals, and embody the divine authority the Empress claimed flowed through her. Their faces were always obscured by thin red veils that fluttered slightly as they walked. No one outside the palace ever saw their eyes. The anonymity gave them an aura of omniscience. People feared them not as individuals, but as extensions of an invisible network that listened, remembered, and judged. The veiled vessels led the ceremonies in every temple and outpost, replacing the old clerics who resisted the empress's reforms. At first, they shared leadership with the male priests who had served for generations. But gradually, by decree after decree, the men found their roles diminished until they became little more than assistants. Some tried to protest. A few vanished after speaking against the empress's integration of rituals. The remaining learned silence. One of the first traditions implemented by this new spiritual order was the Crimson Vigil, a nightly recitation performed in every settlement of the empire. Villagers were expected to gather before a shrine adorned with a red flame, real or painted, and listen as a vessel recited verses describing the empress's chosen destiny. These verses blended fragments of older scriptures with new lines written by the empress herself. Over time, people forgot which lines were ancient and which had been crafted by her hand. The distinction became irrelevant. Faith became inseparable from her story. More unsettling still were the oracle chambers, constructed in major cities and guarded at all hours. Inside each chamber sat a single vessel, positioned on a raised platform surrounded by bowls of smoldering incense. Citizens came seeking guidance on marriages, illnesses, disputes, or travel. The vessel would inhale the incense and deliver prophecies in a monotone voice, often cryptic but always pointing toward loyalty, discipline, and submission to the empress's will. Some said the priestesses memorized thousands of scripted responses. Others believed they possessed genuine sight, sharpened by intense training and ritual isolation. The empress herself visited these chambers in secret, sometimes to test the devotion of her servants, other times to shape the messages delivered to the public. If she wanted to quell rumors or manipulate political currents, she ensured the oracles spoke accordingly. A prophecy murmured beneath a veil carried more weight than any official proclamation. Rites of punishment also fell under the veiled vessel's domain. The empress created ceremonies in which the accused were brought before an altar and asked to confess their sins in the presence of the vessels. The confessions were less about truth and more about submission. A person who admitted guilt, whether real or fabricated, might be allowed to return home after receiving a red mark on the hand, a symbol of both absolution and surveillance. But those who maintained innocence risked facing the trial by flame, an ordeal involving heated metal tools, burning incense, or walking across smoldering coals. Survival meant the gods had protected them. Failure meant the gods had delivered judgment. These rituals spread fear across the empire, not merely because of their cruelty, but because they were wrapped in the language of holiness. People questioned whether they were resisting tyranny or divine order. Even skeptics hesitated to speak against them, unsure whether the vessel's prophecies were political manipulation or genuine insights into unseen forces. In this way, the empress blurred the boundaries between governance and faith. Her rituals absorbed the spiritual life of the empire, turning worship into obedience and fear into devotion. And with every generation raised under these practices, her spiritual authority became harder to untangle from the identity of the empire itself, until resisting her traditions seemed equivalent to rejecting the gods entirely. The empire did not collapse in a single night of rebellion or through the triumph of a righteous enemy. Its downfall unfolded slowly, like a massive structure cracking beneath its own weight. The Scarlet Empress had built a world so dependent on ritual, fear, and symbolism that once a few pillars weakened, the entire system began to tremble. But even in her final days, her traditions refused to die, quietly. They clung to the population like shadows, shaping the way people mourned her fall and feared what might replace her. The first fracture appeared within the ranks of the veiled vessels. For decades, their devotion had been absolute. They carried the empress's words into every corner of the empire, enforcing her doctrines with quiet authority. But dissent grew. Not because they doubted her power, but because they feared her successors would misuse it. With the empress aging and showing signs of illness she refused to acknowledge, factions formed among the priestesses, some insisting her rituals were divine law, others believing they should be preserved only symbolically, and a more secretive group arguing that the traditions had become dangerous even to themselves. When the empress withdrew into her private chambers for what would be her final month alive, the empire erupted in speculation. Rumors spread that she had begun performing rituals on herself, desperate to extend her life or commune with the spirits she claimed had guided her. Others whispered that she was preparing a massive empire-wide ceremony to secure loyalty beyond death. Whatever the truth, her absence from public view created a vacuum no one dared to fill. The nobles saw opportunity. Families long suppressed by the empress's rules began forging alliances in the dark, hoping to position themselves for power once she was gone. Old rivals met in abandoned temples, discussing which traditions could be abolished, which should remain, and, most dangerously, who could claim the empress's legacy. Some sought to install a puppet ruler wrapped in her symbols. Others wanted to erase every trace of her influence. But fear kept them cautious. They knew the population was divided. Many despised the empress, yet others revered her with almost religious fervor. When she finally died, the announcement was delayed for 3 days. The palace claimed it was to prepare the proper rites, but most believed the delay was meant to prevent riots. Even so, the empire erupted in chaos when the news spread. Some cities mourned with processions of red lanterns. Others burned effigies of her face, celebrating the end of an era that had suffocated them. And in certain remote villages, her followers refused to accept her death at all. They claimed she would rise again, reborn through flame, as she had always promised. The new regime acted quickly, ordering the removal of her symbols from public spaces. Mirrors reappeared in government halls. Red banners were torn down, and the priestesses were stripped of political authority. But the traditions she forged were not so easily erased. Many had become ingrained in the rhythm of daily life. Families continued tying red cords on children during rites of passage. Soldiers still painted thin streaks of red on their faces before battle. Couples whispered the vows of the scarlet binding at private ceremonies, convinced the old words still carried protection. Some customs were quietly absorbed into other religions, disguised as harmless rituals. The Crimson Vigil became a simple evening prayer. The ceremony of First Shadow evolved into a children's festival game. Even the binding cut survived in certain artisan guilds, reduced to a small symbolic scratch made with a painted twig rather than a blade. But there were darker remnants, too. Secret societies formed around fragments of her teachings, interpreting her writings as sacred scripture. These groups preserved the harsher traditions, punishments, ordeals, and rituals of power, believing the empire had fallen not because the empress was cruel, but because her followers had grown weak. They conducted clandestine ceremonies in abandoned temples, using her symbols to initiate new members. In some regions, these societies became influential enough to manipulate local politics, resurrecting her ideology in softened or distorted forms. By the time a new dynasty finally stabilized the empire, the empress's legacy had become an intricate web of myth, rumor, and surviving custom. Some traditions had faded into obscurity, others had been transformed beyond recognition, and a select few endured almost unchanged, practiced quietly by people who no longer remembered their origins. The empress was gone, but the world she shaped refused to release its grip. Her rituals lived on, embedded in culture, memory, and superstition, waiting for the moment when another ambitious figure might resurrect them in her name. Long after her death, scholars, priests, and rulers tried to explain how one woman had reshaped an entire civilization through ritual alone. Some described the Scarlet Empress as a tyrant whose cruelty disguised itself as ceremony. Others insisted she was a visionary who understood the human need for structure, meaning, and fear. Yet the truth that survived in whispers was far more unsettling. Her traditions endured because they revealed something people were reluctant to face. Her rituals did not invent darkness. They exposed the darkness already within society, giving it form, order, and purpose. In the centuries that followed, chroniclers attempted to categorize her legacy. Was she a monster or a mirror? Her story appeared in conflicting accounts. Some depicted her as a demon draped in silk, others as a saint punished by history for daring to claim spiritual authority in a world ruled by men. Archaeologists uncovered fragments of red-stained altars, clay tablets etched with her symbols, and ceremonial blades believed to be part of the binding cut. Debate erupted over whether these items proved the horrors described in older texts or were exaggerated by later rulers trying to justify their own rise to power. Myths evolved as well. In some regions, she became a cautionary tale told to disobedient daughters. Do not be too ambitious, or the empress will claim you. Elsewhere, she was transformed into a goddess of protection. Her red mark reimagined as a blessing against evil. Children played games inspired by her trials, never realizing the origins of the gestures they performed. And in the courts of new dynasties, political advisors invoked her legacy whenever they needed to justify dramatic reforms, warning that without disciplined rituals, any empire could fall into chaos. What fascinated scholars most, however, were the psychological traces she left behind. Even stripped of their cruelty, her traditions had reshaped how people understood loyalty, identity, and power. The idea that allegiance required ceremony persisted long after her banners faded. Communities continued to gather at dusk for recitations derived from the Crimson Vigil, unaware of the ritual's earlier purpose. Couples exchanged modified versions of the scarlet binding, believing the red thread symbolized passion rather than control. Armies maintained symbolic markings before battle, interpreting them as heritage instead of indoctrination. The Empress's influence also lingered in the way people feared ambition, especially female ambition. Her story became a tool used by later historians to reinforce anxieties about women who sought authority. Some denounced powerful women as new Scarlet Empresses, using her memory as a weapon to discredit them. Ironically, this ensured her presence remained alive in political discourse, long after the true details of her life had blurred into legend. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of her legacy was its silence. No matter how many artifacts were discovered, no matter how many scrolls survived, one piece of the story was always missing: her own voice. The Empress left behind no diaries, no letters, no confessions. Everything we know about her was filtered through admirers, enemies, or those terrified of both. And yet her rituals endured more faithfully than the words of kings. They persisted because they touched something primal, an understanding that power is sustained not through laws or armies but through shared beliefs repeated across generations. In that sense, the Scarlet Empress never truly vanished. She lived on in every tradition that borrowed her symbols, in every ritual that echoed her structure, in every whispered story passed from elders to children. She became less a historical figure and more a pattern woven into the fabric of cultural memory. Whether feared or revered, she remained unforgettable. And if her traditions could survive centuries of suppression, reinterpretation, and denial, one question inevitably rises. Were they ever truly hers alone, or were they reflections of what humans are capable of when they surrender themselves to ritual without understanding where it leads? If you stayed with me until now, let me know you reached the end by leaving a comment saying something like, "I walked through the Scarlet Path." It helps me understand how deeply this story resonated with you. And if this journey into forgotten power has given you something valuable to think about, Consider subscribing so you can explore more histories that hide in the shadows. A like on this video also helps keep these stories alive for others who are searching for them. And if you want to continue down this darker corridor of the past, there is another video waiting for you right here. Click on it and follow the thread a little further.